Today I wanted to talk about the Genesis creation account. There are many different views on how literally this creation account should be taken, but I specifically wanted to address the most literal interpretation, that a plain reading of Genesis has an accurate description of how the universe was created. Around the world, this isn't the most prevalent interpretation of Genesis, but in the Bible Belt where I live, pretty much everybody believes in a literal account of creation. This is also called young earth creationism. Those unfamiliar with this language, a young earth creationist is someone who believes that the earth is very young, about 6,000 years old, and that it was made in 6 literal days.
Scripture teaches a young universe. It's clear that God created in 6 days, and it tells us what he did on each of those days. It's clear from context. Those are ordinary days because they're bound by an evening and a morning. Some people have tried to stretch that out into ages, but that won't work in the Hebrew based on the context, because you're bound by evening and morning, and there's a number with them and so on. Human beings are made on the 6th day, and from those genealogies you love to read before you go to bed, and so beget so-and-so, you can add up those ages, and it's no harder than balancing your checkbook, and it's a few thousand years. And the universe, by the way, that most of the celestial objects in the universe are made on day 4, and so that pins the universe at a few thousand years as well.
Historical origin science. Now, just to understand, so you understand where I'm coming from, yes, we admit we build our origins of historical science on the Bible. The Bible says God created in 6 days. The Hebrew word yom, as it's used in Genesis 1 with the evening morning number, means an ordinary day. Adam was made on day 6. And so, when you add up all those genealogies specifically given in the Bible, from Adam to Abraham, you've got 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, 2,000 years from Christ to the present 2,000 years. That's how we get 6,000 years. So that's where it comes from.
The God that I worship wrote a book that anybody can read and understand the vast majority of it. And this book clearly says God made everything in 6 days. They were days just like we have today. I think the Big Bang Theory is one of the most ridiculous ideas I've ever heard of in the world.
One of the reasons I'm creating this presentation is that I've seen a recent trend in people trying to prove that scientific findings and a young earth creationist point of view are incompatible. But I don't see very many people that just read through the Genesis story itself and see if it's supposed to be taken literally by its own account. Maybe the creation story was just meant to be taken metaphorically, or maybe it was supposed to serve a non-literal purpose, such as a moral purpose. So for this presentation, I'm going to try to stay away from scientific inaccuracies of the Genesis story, and try to stick to the text itself. But first I want to stress when exactly the story was written, and when modern science began. Here's a timeline that will show just how much time has passed since the writing of the Genesis account and modern science. This first highlighted section you will see is when pretty much every scholar dates the authorship of Genesis. And the second highlighted section is when the modern science really began. Okay, so we'll start at day 1. So God creates the heavens and the earth. He makes the earth void and formless. What does this mean exactly? Void makes sense to us. We know that God adds to the earth later, so it makes sense to us that it's empty right now. But formless? The Hebrew word used here is tohu, which literally means shapeless or formless. This is kind of hard to picture exactly what this means. It appears that even though the earth was created on day 1, it had no shape, it had no form, and it was empty. We know there was water. It mentions that the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water, but it had no form. I only mention this because I think most people, when they think of the verse, God created the heavens and the earth, they think of a round earth popping into existence. But it appears that the author of Genesis thinks that it was not only empty, but it had no shape and no form. Again, this is kind of hard to picture in your mind, but so we'll move on. After he creates the formless and empty earth, God creates light. He separates the light from darkness and calls the light day and the darkness night. We'll come back to this later, but the language here does seem a little strange to me. This is going to be a little picky, but it seems to say from the text that it is either light or either dark, which means that it is either day or either night, and we know that it's daytime some places and nighttime some other places. Again, this is a little picky, so we'll just keep moving along to the second day, where things start to get a little weirder. So on the second day, God creates an expanse in the middle of the waters. And the expanse separates the waters that were below the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. This is talking about the sky. It seems to say that all the sky is the space wedged between the waters of below and the waters of above. Now, from an ancient viewpoint, this actually does make some sense, because not only was the sky blue, but water also fell from the sky in the form of rain. Also, if you look at the worldview that all the Mesopotamia area had, or also called the ancient Middle East, that they had at the time, they had the same belief as well. You have to remember that the Israelites were not isolated from the worldviews of others. They interacted with other cultures just like we do today. Okay, let's go on to the third day, though. On the third day, God gathers all the water under the heavens into one place. Okay, let's stop here real quick. This seems to be the time when the earth gains some shape. Before, if you remember back to day one, the earth was created formless or shapeless. Now, all the water is gathered into one place. Also, God makes dry land appear. But for me, this clarifies that before, when God created the formless earth, it was literally just water spread out under the heavens. After God brings all the water to one place and makes dry land appear, God creates the plants, and all the plants. This is very important to remember, because this is the first life God makes on earth. Remember that plants are the first life that God makes on earth. We'll come back to this later. So now we're on the fourth day. On the fourth day, God makes the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars. Obviously, this is talking about the sun and the moon. But wait a second. I thought on the first day, light was made. And this light was separated by darkness, and the light was called day, and the darkness was called night. So this means on the first day, day and night were made. How can that be true if on the fourth day, the sun and the moon are made? Everyone knows that the sun is necessary for day and night to exist. But what caused day and night for the author of Genesis for the first 3 days of creation until the sun was made on the fourth day? Let me illustrate why I believe the author seems to consciously separate the creation of daytime and nighttime from the creation of the sun and the moon. So God makes day and night on day 1, but makes the sun and the moon on day 4. Also, the sun and the moon don't actually make it day or night. If you look at Genesis 1:16, you can see that they just rule over day or night. Okay, so this actually kind of makes sense from the perspective of someone who probably thought that the sun revolved around the earth, because they clearly thought that both the sun and the moon were lights, and because they were both lights, the sun just being a bigger light, the sun couldn't cause it to be daytime, because if the sun caused it to be daytime, then the lesser light, the moon, should have caused it to be bright outside whenever it came out at night. But when the moon comes out at night, it stays dark. Would have separated the creation of day and night from the creation of the sun and the moon. For the author of Genesis, when it was daytime, the sun just comes out, and when it was nighttime, the moon comes out. But they did not cause it to be day or cause it to be night. Whatever the author believed, we now know this to be wrong. We know that without the sun, there could be no day, and there could be no night. So now we're on to the fifth day. On the fifth day, God makes swimming things, and some translations say sea monsters, mine says sea creatures, but he makes swimming things and he makes birds. That's really all I have for the fifth day, so we'll go right on to the sixth. Now we're on the sixth day. On the sixth day, God creates animals and insects, and here comes the good part. God then makes man in his image. Now look closely at the language used in Genesis 1:26. It says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Now this is a topic for another time. I thought I'd just point it out. But what does that mean, in our likeness? Let's actually talk about what it means when God says, let's make man in his own image. Already, we can't take this literally. Does this actually mean that God has anthropomorphic characteristics? Does that mean he looks like a human? Some Christians say this means that he gave us a spirit or a soul that was like his, but either way, you can't take this literally. Also, it's probably useful to point out that the author probably didn't believe in a soul, because Jews don't believe in souls, and the author was a Jew. But we'll move on. After making man, God then tells him to be fruitful and multiply, and that he has dominion over all the other animals and over all of creation. So now on to the final day of creation. On the seventh day, God doesn't do any work here at all. In fact, he rests from his day's work. Now this always slightly confused me, because why does God have to rest? Also, I do want to point out, it's very clear that he's resting from his work. I only mention this because my pastor used to say that he's not resting because he's tired, but because he wanted to look at the beauty of his work. But this isn't said anywhere in the text, and it even seems to stress the fact that he's resting because he's tired. So now, before we go on to the second creation story, I need to tell you a little Hebrew. The Hebrew word yom is used for day here. Now, yom is translated in many different ways in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, yom is translated as day, time, chronicles, daily, ever, year, continually, when, as, while, full, always, whole, always, age, elder, end, evening, life, so long as, live, even now, old, outlived, perpetually, presently, remaineth, required, season, since, space, then, in, trouble, weather, younger, and then my lexicon literally says miscellaneous. The definition used for yom in a specific translation is slightly subjective, as the author must do his best to use the context around the word to figure out what yom means. It does seem to mean a 24-hour day in the context used in the Genesis passages, though. In the first creation story, the context is, it was evening, and it was morning, and the blank number of day, or yom. It seems to mean a 24-hour day, but many people do try to say that these days could be a period of time because of all the different uses of the Hebrew word yom. So it's important that you know why. So now we're on to the second creation story. You can tell exactly where it begins because of the nice little intro it gives here. Also, the poetic structure from the first creation story seems to stop here. In the first creation story, you had a very rigid structure of God saying, "Let there be this was made, God was pleased with what he made, it was good, it was morning, evening, and then the number of days." The second creation story is just a story, just a narration. So let's get on with it now. Okay, so right away, quite a bit happens. The first part says that before any plant of the field was on the earth, God makes man from the dust of the ground. We're going to have to stop here already. If you remember back to the first creation story, plants were the first living thing created, but in this second creation story, man is made before plants. Let's read it again before we say that this was a contradiction. So I'm reading 2:5 right now. Genesis 2:5. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land, and was watering the whole face of the ground. This is 2:7. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground. So before there was any plant of the field on earth, God forms man from the dust. This seems to be a contradiction. I mean, in the first Genesis story, plants are clearly the first life that's made. And in the second one, it even states that man is made before the plants. The order here changes. Okay, so after God makes man a living creature, he then plants the garden into the east. In the garden, he makes trees out of the ground, and with those trees, he makes two very special trees, and he puts those in the middle of the garden. The lesser known of these two is the tree of life. It's interesting that no one really ever hears about this one, but the other tree is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Also after this, it gives some rivers that are supposed to give a general location of where the Garden of Eden was located. Two of those rivers, we don't know where they are anymore, but they probably used to exist. Next, God tells the man to work the garden, and that he can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that the day that he eats of it, he shall surely die. Now, we've all heard of this story before. We know that they eat it, and we know that that day they don't die. So already we kind of have to ask ourselves, what kind of death is this? It's not a literal death, right? Next, God needs to find a helper for man, because man's lonely. So God forms every beast of the field out of the ground, and man names every single one of them. Also, a side note, this means that from the second creation story's account, every single animal on Earth had its origin in modern-day Iraq. Out of those animals, Adam can find a helper fit for him. I'm not sure exactly what this means, that none of the animals were fit helpers. We know that woman ends up being the fit helper, but I'm not sure how he decided that especially if he was checking the animals to see if they were fit helpers, but we'll move on. Because there is no fit helper found, God causes man to fall asleep, and he takes one of the ribs and he makes women out of his ribs. An interesting thing to note from the second creation story is God always uses an already existing source to create something. He never creates something from nothing like he does in the first creation story. Also, this is just a side note, but I've actually heard people argue that men have one less rib than women because of this passage. And this is wrong. We have the same amount of ribs. Another thing to note before we move on is there's a pun here that's sort of lost in translation. Earlier it said that Adam is made from the ground and therefore he is called Adam. Well, in Hebrew, Adama means ground and Adam means man. Well, here you see that it says woman came from man and therefore she's called woman. Well, in Hebrew, Isha means woman and Ish means man. This is another pun. So now we're to the fall. So it begins by having a talking snake, and then this next part is one that always bothered me as I did my reading in Genesis. It sort of seems like God might be the one lying here, not the serpent. I know this may seem like I'm stretching for something, but let's read it in context. If you go to verse 3, the woman says to the serpent, God said we will die if we eat the fruit. The serpent says, you surely won't die, you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. So I'm going to read that one more time and listen carefully. The woman says to the serpent, God said we will die if we eat the fruit. The serpent says, you surely won't die, you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. That's what happens. God says they will die, and when they eat the fruit, they don't die. The serpent says, you won't die, you will know good and evil. And when they eat it, they don't die, they know good and evil. I mean, obviously, something seems off here. I mean, did the serpent lie somehow? Maybe I missed it? I mean, did God lie? I mean, what just happened? So after they eat the fruit, God then finds out what happened. Man blames woman, woman blames the snake. So God's going to curse all three of them. God first curses the serpent. Because of this curse, snakes walk on their belly, he's going to eat dust, and people are going to hate snakes, and snakes are going to bite people on the feet. Also, just something to note, snakes don't eat dust. But next, after cursing the snake, God also curses women. Because of this, women now have a painful childbirth. They're ruled over by men. I'm going to stop there for a second. This is interesting to me because it's literally saying that the ideal situation is that men and women are equal. But because she is cursed now, men rule over women. After cursing the woman, the man's the last to get cursed. Because of this, work is now going to be hard. He'll sweat now. Thorns on plants. And also when he dies, he's going to turn into dust. This is also a very picky thing. But God only curses man with the curse that when he dies, he's going to turn into dust. But everything after it dies turns into dust. But kind of picky. So, after cursing them, woman is now called Eve. God makes Adam and Eve clothes out of the skin of animals. And again, we have this language of one of us, of God saying one of us. But again, that'll be a talk for another time. So after cursing them, God then takes away the tree of immortality. Now this is probably the most skipped over passage of the second creation story. But God then guards the tree of immortality with a cherubim, which is like a celestial being. I'll show pictures of it. And a floating flaming sword. I'm not even kidding. And what's the reasoning, by the way? God says, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he eats of the tree of life, he will become like one of us. This is very interesting reasoning. Now it's finally time to decide whether or not these two stories are to be taken literally or not. First, I need to emphasize why these are two very different accounts. People tend to combine these, the first and second creation story, like they are one and the same story. They don't seem to be. First of all, there's clearly a break in the structure of the story. One has a very poetic structure, while the other is just a story. It's just a narrative. Also, the nature of how God creates things changes from the first story to the second. In the first story, he says, "Let there be something," and something is made. In the second story, God appears to be more of a sculptor, creating things from material that already exists. Also, their orders contradict each other. The first Genesis account has plants being made on the third day, then fish, then birds, then insects, animals, and then man. The second creation account has man being made first, then plants, animals, and then women. Also, just one last thing to prove that these are probably different stories. They also seem to have different authors. In the first account, the word God is used 33 times. Each time the Hebrew word Elohim is used. This technically is plural, it means gods, but again, that's a point for a different time. But in the second account, the Hebrew word Yahweh is used every time. It's used 10 times. Most Bibles even denote this change in English by just saying God in the first account and saying Lord God in the second. Most Bible scholars say that the fact that the structure of the two stories contrasts so vividly, the fact that they seem to contradict each other, and the fact that the language used is different, and also that the nature of how God creates things is different, points to the evidence that there are two different authors here. One author who wrote the first creation account, and one who wrote the second. If you remember back to my introduction at the beginning of the presentation, I alluded to the fact that maybe the Genesis stories had a non-literal purpose. I'm going to state what I think the purpose may be. In the first Genesis creation account, the purpose seems to be that man has dominion over all of creation. God creates everything, and then creates man last and makes him ruler of the creation. Also, I believe a minor purpose is to establish the Sabbath day, the day of rest. The second creation account seems to be a lot more personal and has more of a mythical feel to it. The second story states why man is called man. Adama means dust, Adam means man. It also states why woman is called woman. Isha means woman, Ish means man. It has a talking snake. It answers the question, why do snakes crawl on their belly? Because he was cursed by God. Why does childbirth hurt? But more importantly, it gives an explanation of why us humans wear clothes. And also, why do us humans seem to have so much more knowledge than the other animals around us? It also answers the question, why aren't we immortal like God is? These are important things to realize because of not only what I just said, but because you can't take the stories literally by their own account. If you take them both literally, then you have a contradiction in the order of the events that happened. Were plants created first, or was man created first? If you take them both literally, it's a question you can't answer. If you only take one literally, how are you going to decide which one? Also, where does light come from? We know that it comes from the sun, but the author of Genesis doesn't seem to believe so. He creates light, day and night, on day 1, and creates the sun on day 4. Is the moon a light? This is the image given from the author of Genesis. Is there a layer of water hanging above the sky? The author of Genesis seems to believe so. And here comes the point of the presentation. Can you truly say, after reading the Genesis stories, that they should be taught not only as historically true, but in a science classroom, as many advocate here? Another question I have is, does the Bible have to be perfect in order to be authoritative? This is an important question. I mean, think about your parents. Are they perfect? Do they even claim to be perfect? No, no parent would say that they were perfect. In fact, they would happily admit their mistakes. But are they authoritative? Yes. It's common sense that something doesn't have to be perfect to be authoritative. The last thing I want to talk about is just my personal conclusion after doing this presentation. I do find it hard to believe that a book that has talking snakes and talking donkeys with dozens of 900-year-old people with half God, half humans, and I'm not talking about Jesus here, I'm talking about the warriors of old in Genesis 6, with giants, with dragons, with fruits that cause an increase of knowledge or immortality, with boats that held every single animal in the world, to be taken as a convincing foundation for science classes in the 21st century. After all that, these stories were passed down orally for hundreds of years and were written down thousands of years ago, and many times from an anonymous author from unknown locations, written at an unknown time. It's just hard for me to take that as historical science. And I'm not completely closed-minded. If you believe that these should be taught as historically true, all I have to say is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And all you have to do is be willing to prove that any of these things I mentioned are first plausible, and then after that prove that they actually happened. And let's take evolution, for example. I would call evolution an extraordinary claim. That all life we see here comes from a common ancestor over billions of years, and because of evolution, we see all the diversity of life that we see today. So if someone wanted to prove to you evolution was true, it would also require extraordinary evidence. To conclude this presentation, though, let me summarize my points. I don't think the purpose of the Genesis stories were to be historically accurate to begin with. I think they were probably to answer some questions that were important to the author and the people of the time. I think the purpose might have been just that God created everything that we see, and that we are different than the animals around us. That God's immortal and we aren't. It answers the question of why we wear clothes, why women are submissive to men, why does water fall from the sky, why does the sun show up in the daytime, etc. And these might have been rather shallow questions, especially to us now, but to the people of the ancient world, these might have been ideas that they really struggled with. The story may have been the author's way to illuminate truths, or maybe to illuminate questions that they had to wrestle with.